There are questions a man of God should never have to answer. Questions like, does the body of Christ still mean something when you're serving it off an ammunition crate? Can you offer absolution to a boy who's about to be ordered to kill? How do you explain why God would allow what I saw in those trenches? 22 years later, I still don't have answers. I was 31 years old when America entered the war, pastor of a Presbyterian church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Good congregation, nice parsonage, a wife and 2 young daughters. I'd spent 8 years preaching about faith and sacrifice from a comfortable pulpit, telling young men about duty and righteousness. When the war came, when they started forming up the divisions, I felt called to go. Felt like a hypocrite sending other men to do what I wouldn't. My wife begged me not to, said I had a family, a congregation that needed me. She was right, but I went anyway. Told myself I was needed more over there, with the boys who'd be facing death. Told myself I could bring comfort, bring God's presence to that hellish place. I believed in the war then, believed in the cause. Wilson said we were making the world safe for democracy, fighting to end all wars. From my pulpit, it had sounded noble, righteous even. The Army made me a captain, gave me a uniform and a collar insignia with a cross. Assigned me to the 28th Infantry Division as a chaplain. They gave us a week of training. How to salute, how to write casualty notifications, how to avoid getting killed. Then they shipped us to France. I arrived at the front in June of 1918, full of purpose and faith, ready to minister to the troops, to be a light in the darkness. I had my Bible, my communion kit, my Book of Common Prayer. I thought I was prepared. Nothing prepares you for the trenches. The smell hit me first. Death and latrines and gas and decay all mixed together into something that coated your throat, that you could taste. The mud was everywhere. Black, sucking mud that pulled at your boots and never dried, and the noise. Even in the quiet sectors, there was always noise. Distant guns, rats scratching, men coughing, the occasional scream from no man's land where the wounded lay dying. I met the regimental commander my first day. Colonel Harrison, regular army, been in France since 17. He looked me over. Clean uniform, new boots, probably saw the uncertainty in my eyes. Glad to have you, Chaplain, he said. The men need spiritual guidance, but I'll tell you straight. Don't fill their heads with nonsense about God protecting them. I've seen too many boys die clutching Bibles. Give them comfort if you can, but don't lie to them. I didn't understand what he meant, not then. My first week, I tried to hold services like I did back home, set up in a dugout behind the lines, laid out my communion elements nice and proper, waited for the men to come. 3 showed up. 3 out of a regiment of 2,000. Private Williams from Philadelphia came because his mother had asked him to. Sergeant O'Brien came because he was Irish Catholic and felt guilty about missing Mass. And Corporal Davis came because he'd seen his best friend killed the day before and didn't know where else to go. I gave them the service I'd prepared, readings from Matthew, a sermon about faith in difficult times, communion with proper wine and wafers I'd brought from home. It felt hollow. The words echoed in that dugout like they were bouncing off the walls, finding no purchase. After, Corporal Davis stayed behind. 20 years old, hands shaking, eyes red. Chaplain, he said, I need to confess something. Go ahead, son. Yesterday, during the raid, I killed a German soldier, stabbed him with my bayonet. He was young, maybe 18. And while I was doing it, while I was pushing that blade into him, I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, just nothing. What does that make me? I opened my mouth to give him the answer I'd been trained to give. Something about justified warfare, about defending freedom, about righteous combat. But looking at his face, at the emptiness in his eyes, the words died in my throat. I don't know, I said. I honestly don't know. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. That's what I thought. He left, and I sat there in my dugout with my nice communion set, wondering what good I was doing. The next day, I went forward to the front line trenches. If the men wouldn't come to me, I'd go to them. That's what Jesus would do, I told myself. Go to where the people were suffering. Lieutenant Baker, the company commander, looked at me like I was insane. Chaplain, we're in range of German snipers. Artillery comes in random. No man's land is 50 yards away. You sure about this? I'm sure. He shrugged. Your funeral. Try not to get shot. The men don't need to see a chaplain die. Bad for morale. I spent 3 weeks in the forward trenches during July of 1918. Lived with the men, shared their rations, slept in the mud. Held prayer services leaning against the trench wall while shells screamed overhead. Offered communion with my hands shaking from the concussions. The men came to me differently up there, not for services or sermons. They came in the dark, one by one, needing to talk, needing to unburden themselves to someone who wouldn't judge. Private Jackson told me he'd shot a German who was trying to surrender. Did it in the heat of the moment, couldn't take it back. Am I going to hell, Chaplain? Sergeant Morrison told me he was glad when certain men in his platoon died. The cowards, the ones who couldn't pull their weight. I watched them get hit and felt relieved. What kind of monster am I? Corporal Andrews told me he prayed every night that he'd get wounded. Not killed, just wounded bad enough to go home. Does that make me a coward? Does God hate me for wanting out? I tried to give them comfort, tried to offer absolution, reassurance, hope, but every word felt like a lie. How could I promise God's forgiveness when I didn't understand God's purpose in any of this? On July 18th, we went over the top as part of the Allied counteroffensive. I wasn't supposed to go. Chaplains typically stayed back. But I couldn't send these men into that hell alone. I climbed the ladder with them. The barrage had been going for 3 hours. The noise was beyond description. Every nerve in your body vibrating, men vomiting from the concussion, officers screaming orders nobody could hear. When the whistles blew, we went over. I carried my Bible and my cross, wearing my chaplain's armband. Thought it might help. Thought God might protect a minister doing his work. The Germans had machine guns waiting, cut through our first wave like wheat. I saw Private Jackson, the one who'd killed the surrendering German, take a round through the chest. He went down calling for his mother. I tried to reach him, but the bullets were everywhere, cracking past, kicking up dirt. I dove into a shell crater. There were already 4 men there, 3 alive, 1 dead. We huddled there for hours while the battle raged around us. One of the men, a kid named Tommy from Ohio, he was hit bad. Stomach wound, bleeding out slow. He grabbed my hand. Chaplain, am I dying? I wanted to lie. Wanted to tell him he'd be fine. But he deserved the truth. Yes, son, you are. Will it hurt? I don't know. I hope not. He started crying. Not sobbing, just tears running down his face. I'm scared. I don't want to die here. I don't want to die in the mud. I held his hand and recited the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. The words felt absurd with machine guns rattling and shells exploding, but they were all I had. He died before I finished. Just stopped breathing, his hand going limp in mine. I closed his eyes and said a prayer over him, but I didn't feel God there. Didn't feel anything but the wet mud and the deafening noise and the complete senselessness of it all. We made it back to our lines after dark. The attack had gained maybe 300 yards, cost us 200 casualties. Tommy from Ohio was one of 47 men from our regiment who died that day. That night, I tried to pray. Really pray, not just recite words, tried to understand God's plan, to find meaning in what I'd seen. But the prayers felt like they were hitting the ceiling of my dugout and falling back down, like there was nobody listening. August was worse. The fighting intensified as we pushed toward the German lines. The casualties mounted. I stopped trying to hold formal services. Instead, I just moved through the trenches, being present, talking when men needed to talk, sitting in silence when that's what they needed. I performed communion in the strangest places, kneeling in mud while shells landed 100 yards away, leaning against sandbags during a lull in the fighting. Once, in a captured German bunker still reeking of their dead, the communion elements changed. I ran out of proper wine, started using whatever alcohol the men could scrounge. Cognac one week, terrible red wine the next, once even rum. The wafers ran out too. I used hardtack, crackers, once just torn pieces of bread. "This is my body, broken for you," I'd say, holding up a piece of stale hardtack covered in mud from my hands. It felt like blasphemy. But the men needed it, needed something sacred in all that profanity, needed to believe there was still holiness somewhere in the world, even if it was communion served off an ammunition crate in a shell hole. Private Wilson asked me once, "Chaplain, do you really believe God is here? In this?" I should have said yes. Should have given him certainty, faith, hope. Instead, I said, "I want to believe it. I'm trying to believe it." He nodded. "Yeah, me too." On August 23rd, we took heavy artillery fire. Direct hit on a dugout where 12 men were sheltering. I got there minutes after. The entrance had collapsed. We could hear them inside, screaming, buried alive. We dug, clawed at the earth with our hands, with shovels, with anything we could find. It took 2 hours to reach them. By then, the screaming had stopped. We pulled out 11 bodies, crushed, suffocated, some of them with their hands worn bloody from trying to dig themselves out. The 12th man, Corporal Henderson, was somehow still alive. Barely. He looked at me with eyes that had seen hell, tried to speak, coughed up blood instead. "It's okay," I told him. "You're safe now. God's with you." He grabbed my collar, pulled me close. His voice was barely a whisper. "There's no God here." Then he died. I sat there in the mud, covered in earth and blood, holding a dead man, and I couldn't argue with what he'd said. Because looking around at the destruction, at the senseless waste, at the bodies of young men who died in terror and agony, where was God? I'd been taught that God was everywhere, that his presence was constant, but I couldn't feel it, couldn't see it. All I could see was mud and blood and death. All I could hear was screaming and explosions. All I could smell was decay and gas and fear. That night I opened my Bible to find comfort, tried reading Job about suffering and faith, but the words seemed cruel. Job got his vindication, got his life restored. These boys were just dead. Nothing was being restored. There was no divine purpose I could see, just mechanized slaughter. September brought the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the biggest American battle of the war. We were going to break through the German lines, end the war, they told us. It would be costly, but necessary. Costly. That's what they called it. Thousands of boys torn apart by machine guns and artillery. Costly. I moved with the advance, staying close to the aid stations. That's where they brought the wounded, and that's where they needed a chaplain most. To pray over the dying, to write final letters home, to tell boys missing legs or arms or faces that God still loved them. I got good at lying. Got good at looking at a kid with his guts spilling out and telling him he'd be fine. Got good at holding hands slick with blood and pretending I felt God's presence. Got good at reciting prayers while part of me screamed that none of it meant anything. Private First Class James Murphy from Boston, both legs gone below the knee. 19 years old. Chaplain, why did God let this happen to me? I went to church every Sunday. I was a good person. What do you say to that God works in mysterious ways, that this is part of his plan, that suffering builds character? I don't know, James, I said. I don't know why any of this is happening. He looked surprised. Chaplains weren't supposed to admit doubt. You don't know? No, I wish I did. Then what good is any of it? What good is faith if this is what God allows? I had no answer. On September 29th, I held communion service for a company that was going over the top at dawn. About 80 men gathered in a bombed-out church behind the lines. The roof was gone, walls pocked with shell holes, but the altar was somehow still standing. I laid out my elements: wine that was mostly vinegar, bread that was mostly mold, the body and blood of Christ, degraded like everything else in this war. Take, eat, I said, my voice hollow. This is my body, broken for you. They came forward one by one. Boys with 1,000-yard stares, hands shaking, some of them crying. They took the bread, drank the wine, and I blessed them, told them God would be with them in the battle. 37 of those 80 men died the next day, nearly half. I'd blessed them, promised them God's protection, and they died screaming in the mud anyway. That night, I took off my chaplain's cross and stared at it. This symbol that was supposed to represent hope, salvation, sacrifice. It felt like a lie, a pretty story we told ourselves to make sense of the senseless. I thought about Corporal Henderson's last words. There's no God here. Maybe he was right. Maybe God had abandoned this place, or maybe, and this was the thought that terrified me most, maybe there was no God at all. Maybe we were alone, killing each other for nothing, and all the prayers and rituals and faith were just elaborate ways to avoid facing that truth. I put the cross back on, not because I believed anymore, but because the men needed me to wear it. They needed someone to represent hope, even if that person had none left himself. The armistice came on November 11th. The guns stopped, and we were supposed to rejoice. We'd won. We'd survived. God had delivered us. I felt nothing, just emptiness where my faith used to be. I stayed in France through December, helping with the occupation and cleanup. Mostly, I buried the dead, said prayers over graves, wrote letters to families, tried to give meaning to the meaningless. I came home in February of 1919. My congregation threw a welcome back celebration. They wanted me to talk about my experiences, about God's work in the war, about faith under fire. I couldn't do it, couldn't stand in that pulpit and lie to them, couldn't tell them God had been present in those trenches when I'd seen no evidence of it, couldn't serve them communion from a clean altar with proper elements when I remembered serving it from ammunition crates to boys who'd be dead the next day. I resigned my position in March, told them I needed time to recover, to find my bearings again. The truth was simpler. I'd lost my faith somewhere in the mud of France, and I didn't know how to get it back. My wife tried to understand. She was patient, loving, supportive. But how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I tell her I'd watched boys die calling for God and getting only silence? That I'd prayed over so many corpses the prayers had become meaningless sounds? I had nightmares every night, not about the battles, but about the communion services. I'd dream I was serving the Eucharist, and when the men opened their mouths to receive the bread, they'd scream. Or I'd be holding up the cup saying, "This is my blood shed for you." And it would actually be blood, real blood from the wounded and dying. I tried going back to church as a congregant, sat in the pew while a younger minister preached about God's love and divine providence. Every word felt like nails on a chalkboard. He was saying the same things I used to say with the same certainty. He didn't know, didn't understand that those pretty words fell apart when faced with real horror. I stopped going after a month. For 22 years now, I've lived with this emptiness. I've read theology, philosophy, tried to reason my way back to faith. Some days I think I catch glimpses of it. Watching my daughters grow up, seeing a sunrise, moments of grace that suggest maybe there's something beyond the material. But then I remember. Remember Private Tommy dying in that shell crater holding my hand. Remember the 11 men crushed in that dugout. Remember Corporal Henderson's last words. Remember the 80 men I blessed before they died. And the faith crumbles again. People ask me sometimes if I believe in God. I tell them I want to. That's the honest answer. I desperately want to believe there's meaning, purpose, divine love. I want to believe those boys didn't die for nothing, that their suffering was part of some greater plan I'm too limited to understand. But belief isn't want. Belief is knowing. And I don't know anymore. The worst part isn't the doubt. It's the guilt. I was supposed to bring comfort, bring God's presence to those men. Instead, I brought empty rituals and hollow words. I held communion in the trenches and promised them God was there, and I don't think he was. Maybe he was there and I was too broken to feel it. Maybe my faith wasn't strong enough. Maybe I failed some crucial test. Or maybe Corporal Henderson was right all along. I keep my chaplain's cross in a drawer. Can't look at it most days. It represents a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. A man who believed, who had certainty, who thought he could bring light to darkness. That man died in France. What came back was something else. Something that knows too much and believes too little. The war ended 22 years ago. But for me, it never stopped. I'm still in those trenches, still trying to serve communion to boys who are already ghosts, still searching for God in places he abandoned, or places he never was. They say there are no atheists in foxholes. That's a lie. I met plenty. And I understand why. Because when you've seen what war really is, when you've held communion in hell and watched faith die with the faithful, the easy certainties become impossible. I don't know if there's a God. I don't know if those prayers meant anything. I don't know if the communion I served had any sacred power, or if it was just bread and wine consumed by scared children before they were slaughtered. I wish I knew. God, how I wish I knew. But all I have is doubt and memories, and the terrible suspicion that we were alone in those trenches, that the prayers went nowhere, that the only meaning was what we made ourselves. The chaplain who went to France died there. Who came back was just a man in a collar going through motions, pretending to believe for the sake of others while believing nothing himself. We never came back, not really. My faith stayed in France, buried in the mud with all those boys I couldn't save. And 22 years later, I'm still looking for it. Still hoping that maybe, somehow, it's still there. Still hoping that maybe Corporal Henderson was wrong, but I don't think he was.